The first rays of the morning sun filtered gently through the tall trees as Prince Jide guided his horse deeply into the forest. Whenever the weight of the palace became too much, this was where he came, away from the guards, away from the endless meetings, and away from everyone telling him what a prince should do. The forest was the only place where he could hear his own thoughts. As he followed the narrow path leading towards the river, a soft voice drifted through the morning air. Someone was singing. Prince Jide stopped. The melody was unlike anything he had ever heard. It was gentle, smoothing, and so beautiful that it seemed to flow with the breeze itself. Without realizing it, he found himself following the sound until the thick trees slowly gave way to the quiet river bank. There stood, standing beside the water, was a young woman. A long veil covered her face as she carefully placed a small basket on the grass. After looking around to make sure she was alone, she slowly untied the veil and folded it neatly beside her. Prince Jide forgot to breathe. The morning sunlight rested softly on her face as she knelt beside the river. She was breathtakingly beautiful, yet he was certain he had never seen her anywhere in the kingdom before. Unable to stop himself, he took one careful step closer. A dry twig snapped beneath his foot. The young woman froze. She turned sharply towards the trees. Realizing she heard him, Prince Jide stepped out with both hands raised. "Please, don't be afraid." But panic had already taken hold of her. She grabbed the veil with trembling hands, covered her face, snatched up her basket and ran into the forest as fast as she could. "Wait!" Prince Jide called after her. She never looked back. Within moments, she had disappeared among the trees, leaving only the gentle sound of the flowing river behind. Prince Jide remained where he stood, staring at the path where she had taken. A slow smile spread across his face. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from. But for the first time in his life, he knew he wanted to see her again. Nobody in the kingdom knew who the mysterious girl behind the veil was. But long before Prince Jide caught that brief glimpse of her face, Omara had spent her entire life hiding from a pain she never created. Long before anyone knew the name Omara, there lived a young couple whose love was the kind people spoke about with quiet admiration. In a peaceful kingdom, surrounded by rolling hills, thick forests, and fertile farmlands, Mazi Eze and his wife Chioma had built a home that many believed every young man and woman prayed for. Their compound was never the largest in the village, but it was always the happiest. Every morning began with laughter. Every evening ended with long conversations beneath the old Udala tree that stood proudly in their courtyard, and every neighbor who passed their home could see that the two of them carried a kind of peace that money alone could never buy. Mazi Eze was one of the wealthiest farmers in the kingdom. His yam barns stood tall after every harvest. His cassava fields stretched across fertile land, and his workers often joked that the soil itself smiled whenever he planted. Yet, for all the wealth he possessed, nothing mattered more to him than the woman he called his wife. Chioma, on the other hand, never cared much for riches. She was gentle and kind to everyone she met. It was not unusual to find her sharing food with hungry children or stopping to help an elderly woman carry a heavy basket home from the market. There was only one thing missing from their happiness. Year after year, they waited for the cry of a child to fill their home. They visited respected herbalists. They traveled to distant villages where elders were said to possess uncommon wisdom. They offered prayers, made sacrifices according to the custom of their people, and refused to give up hope. Then, just when they had almost stopped expecting a miracle, Chioma discovered she was carrying a child. For several days, she kept the news to herself, not because she wanted to hide it from her husband, but because she wanted to surprise him. Every evening, she imagined how she would tell him. Sometimes, she pictured herself placing a tiny pair of knitted baby sandals beside his evening meals. Other times, she imagined waiting until the next market day when he would return from the farm tired, only to whisper into his ear that after all these years, he was finally going to become a father. Each time she imagined the smile that would spread across Mazi Eze's face, she found herself smiling too. She decided she would wait just a little longer. One cold evening, after returning from his farm, Mazi Eze ate supper with his wife as he always did. They talked about the coming planting season, laughed over a funny story, and before retiring for the night, he reminded Chioma that they would visit another piece of farmland together after the next market day. There was nothing unusual about that night. He was not sick. He did not complain of pain. He simply wished his wife a peaceful night, lay down to sleep, and never woke up again. Before the first cock crowed, cries had already begun rising from the compound. By sunrise, the entire village had gathered outside Mazi Eze's home. No one could explain how a strong, healthy man who had gone to bed peacefully could simply close his eyes and never open them again. As Chioma sat beside her husband's lifeless body, her world collapsed around her. She held his hand, called his name over and over again, and waited for him to answer, convinced that if she refused to believe in it long enough, he would open his eyes and tell her it had all been a terrible dream. He never did. With trembling fingers, she unconsciously rested one hand on the secret growing quietly beneath her heart, the child she had longed to tell him about, and for the first time since she discovered she was pregnant, the joy she had carried inside her was swallowed completely by grief. The surprise she had planned with so much love would remain untold forever. The days that followed Mazi Eze's burial were unlike anything Chioma had ever imagined. She had not only lost the man she loved, she had also lost the one person who would have believed every word that came out of her mouth without asking for proof. In this village, the sudden death of a healthy husband always invited suspicion before sympathy. It did not matter that there was no wound on his body or any sign that he had been poisoned. The whispers began before the tears on Chioma's face had even dried up. At first, they traveled quietly from one compound to another. Then the whispers grew louder until they became accusations spoken openly in broad daylight. Some insisted no man simply slept and died without a reason. Before long, the fingers that had once pointed towards unseen enemies slowly began pointing towards the widow herself. According to the customs of the kingdom, Chioma could not simply bury her husband and continue with her life. She was expected to undergo the widowhood rite that every woman feared but none dared question. Before the elders and the entire village, she was made to swear that she had no hand in her husband's death. She was taken from one shrine to another, forced to perform humiliating rites meant to prove her innocence. While many people watched not with compassion but with curiosity, as though they were waiting for her to confess to a crime she had never committed. Through it all, she remained silent, hoping that if she endured everything patiently, the truth would eventually speak for itself. It never did. Then as the weeks passed, another secret could no longer remain hidden. The loosened wrapper she wore each day could no longer conceal the gentle curve beginning to form beneath them. One elderly woman noticed it at first. By evening, the entire village was already talking. Before Chioma could gather the courage to explain that she had discovered the pregnancy only shortly before her husband's death, the rumors had outrun the truth. People began asking why Mazi Eze had never spoken about expecting a child. Others claimed that if the pregnancy had truly belonged to her husband, everyone in the household would have known. The cruelest voices insisted that the child belonged to another man, and that the pregnancy itself was proof that she had betrayed her husband while he was still alive. Every explanation she tried to offer sounded like an excuse to people who had already made up their minds. No one knew that every evening she had rehearsed how she would tell him he was finally going to become a father. The only person who had known that secret had been Mazi Eze himself in her imagination, because he had not lived long enough to hear it. Now, the surprise she had carefully protected had become the very thing people used against her. The child she had once carried with joy suddenly became another reason for the village to despise her. The weight of grief, humiliation, and endless accusation slowly began to crush her spirit. Sleep became a stranger. Food lost its taste. Some mornings she sat in the same spot for hours without moving, staring at nothing while people passed by, pretending not to notice. Other days, she would begin speaking to Mazieze as though he was still sitting beside her beneath the udala tree, smiling gently while waiting for him to answer. The women whispered that sorrow had entered her head. The elders shook theirs sadly whenever they saw her wandering through the compound with empty eyes. Before long, the cheerful woman whose laughter had once brightened every corner of the village became someone people spoke about in rushed voices. By the time the rains gave way to harvests, Chioma had completely lost her grip on reality, and the child growing quietly beneath her heart became the only innocent soul carrying the burden of a tragedy she had never caused. The day Chioma went into labor, the entire village expected another tragedy. Some women only came because they wanted to witness what would happen, while others stood outside the small mud house, whispering amongst themselves that no child born under such circumstances could possibly bring anything good. But when the baby's first cry echoed through the compound, something unexpected happened. The old midwife, who had delivered hundreds of children over the years, stepped outside with tears in her eyes and quietly decreed that she had never seen such a beautiful little girl. Her skin glowed like a polished bronze. Her tiny fingers curled tightly around the midwife's hand, and even before her eyes opened completely, there was something unusually peaceful about her face. The child was named Omara. Sadly, the joy of her birth never reached her mother. Chioma's mind had already wandered far into places that no one could reach. Some days, she recognized her own daughter and held her close for hours without saying a word. Other days, she stared at the little girl as though she had never seen her before. There were mornings she wandered through the village, calling Mazieze's name, convinced he had only gone to the farm and would soon return. The villagers watched from a distance with pity, while the children, too young to understand pain, often laughed and ran after her. Omara grew up seeing all of it. Before she was old enough to understand words, she had already understood shame. Years passed by quietly. The little girl who had once slept peacefully in her mother's arms slowly grew into a graceful young maiden. As she grew older, something else became impossible to ignore. Her beauty was unlike anything people had expected. Even the elderly women who still remembered her mother's wedding would occasionally pause whenever Omara walked past, wondering how someone could possess such striking features. But very few people ever saw more than her eyes. By then, Chioma's mind had begun returning little by little. The herbalists never claimed to have cured her completely, but the herbs they prepared, combined with time, gradually brought back pieces of the woman she used to be. She remembered her husband's laughter, the accusations. She remembered the pregnancy, everyone who had turned against her, and every insult that had pushed her into darkness. And because she remembered, fear settled permanently inside her heart. Whenever she looked at Omara, she no longer saw only her daughter. She saw the child whose unborn existence had become another weapon people had used to destroy her life. She never hated the girl. If anything, she loved her too much. That love, however, became tangled with fear. From the day Omara was old enough to walk to the stream alone, Chioma began covering her face with long veils. It became such a normal part of Omara's life that she could hardly remember what it felt like to walk through the village with her face uncovered. "Never let anyone see your face," Chioma would always say. "Some beauties invite blessings, others invite suffering. I've already lost everything. I cannot lose you too." Omara never argued. She had watched her mother's eyes fill with fear each time she tried to ask why. Eventually, she stopped asking. The villagers created their own stories instead. Some believed that the girl carried a terrible curse. Others insisted there must be a frightening scar beneath the veil. The younger children often whispered whenever she passed, while grown women shook their heads and called her strange. Omara simply lowered her eyes and continued with her life. She fetched water, gathered firewood, helped elderly women whenever she could, and returned home before sunset every single day. Then one quiet morning, everything changed. The rainy season had ended, leaving the forest greener than it had been in years. Omara carried her basket towards the river before sunrise, believing she would have enough time to bathe before anyone else arrived. It was the only place she was allowed herself a few precious moments without the veil. Looking around carefully, she untied the cloth from her face and folded it beside the basket before kneeling near the water, humming softly as she washed her hands. She had no idea that not far away, Prince Jide had chosen that same morning to escape the noise of the palace. Driven by the gentle sound of her singing, he followed the melody until the trees opened into the river bank. Then he saw her. For one breathtaking moment, the entire world seemed to stand still. He forgot about the kingdom. He forgot about why he came into the forest at all. All he could see was the young woman by the river. Unable to stop himself, he stepped forward. A dry twig cracked beneath his foot. Omara spun around. The moment their eyes met, fear swept across her face. She grabbed her veil, covered herself in one hurried moment, picked up her basket, and fled into the forest before Prince Jide could ever explain who he was. He stood there smiling long after she had disappeared among the trees. For the first time in many years, he found himself hoping fate would allow their paths to cross again. And before that chance would come, an announcement echoed across the kingdom. The king had finally chosen the day when every eligible maiden would gather before the royal family, according to the kingdom's ancient tradition, so that Prince Jide could choose the woman he wished to make his bride. The announcement spread from one end of the kingdom to the other before sunset. According to the tradition that had existed for generations, whenever a prince was old enough to marry, every unmarried maiden of age would gather at the royal square on an appointed evening. There would be music, dancing, and display of skill and grace, not because the prince was expected to choose the most beautiful woman, but because the elders believed a person's true character revealed itself when joy filled the air. Families spent weeks preparing their daughters for the occasion, sewing new wrappers, polishing beads that had been passed down through generations, and praying that fortune would smile upon their homes. Before long, every compound in the kingdom was talking about only one thing: the choosing of the maidens. Omara never imagined she would be part of it. She listened quietly as young women returning from the stream spoke excitedly about the ceremony, laughing as they compared the clothes they intended to wear. Deep inside, she wondered what it felt like to stand among other maidens without hiding behind a veil, but the thought disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Her mother had made one thing clear throughout her entire life: their family had no place where crowds gathered, and under no circumstance was she ever to let strangers see her face. Then the day finally arrived. That morning, Chioma had left the house before sunrise to gather medicinal leaves from the forest. Although her mind had returned over the years, fear had never left her. Before stepping outside, she reminded Omara to fetch firewood before evening and warned her not to wander anywhere near the royal square. Omara nodded obediently, just as she always did, and waited until her mother disappeared along the narrow forest path. For several minutes, she remained seated in silence. Then she looked towards the neatly folded wrappers she had secretly kept beneath a wooden box. For the first time in her life, she made a decision for herself. She carefully had a bath, dressed in the finest wrapper she had owned, braided her hair beautifully, placed coral beads around her neck, and stared at the veil lying across her lap. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It had been part of her life for as long as she could remember. It had hidden her laughter, her tears, her fears, and even the face she no longer recognized as her own. Slowly, she folded it. By the time Omara reached the royal square, music already filled the air. Maidens danced in colorful wrappers while drums echoed across the kingdom. The elders watched proudly from carved wooden seats as families cheered for their daughters. Omara stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, almost turning back several times before she finally found the courage to step forward. The moment Prince Jide saw her, he recognized her immediately. She was the mysterious woman from the river, the same eyes, the same graceful movements, the same face that had refused to leave his thoughts for weeks. Throughout the celebration, his eyes never left her. While others competed for attention, Omar simply danced with quiet joy, completely unaware that the prince had been watching her from the very beginning. Then the palace drum sounded 12 slow beats. Omara's smile disappeared. "My mother!" The words escaped her lips before she could realize she had spoken them. Without waiting for the ceremony to end, she turned and began pushing gently through the crowd. Prince Jide immediately followed, calling for her to stop, but she was already running towards the palace gate. Just as he reached out to her to stop her, his hands caught the edge of one of her veils she had wrapped loosely around her shoulders for the cold evening breeze. The cloth slipped freely into his hands while Omara disappeared into the darkness beyond the palace road. Prince Jide stood there holding the veil, smiling quietly to himself. This time, he would not lose her. The following morning, he walked into the king's chamber before anyone else arrived. "Father," he said respectfully, "I have found the woman I wish to marry." The king smiled. "Then why did you return alone?" Prince Jide looked down at the veil resting in his hands before answering, "Because I do not yet know where she lives." The king ordered horsemen to accompany the prince, and before long, word spread that the royal family was searching for a mysterious woman whose beauty had captured the prince's heart. The description traveled from village to village until an elderly woman quietly mentioned that there was only one maiden in the entire kingdom who had spent her life hiding behind veils. She is the daughter of the widow everyone once called mad. Without wasting another moment, Prince Jide mounted his horse. "I have found her," he said, and together the royal procession made its way towards the small mud house where Omara and her mother lived. By the time the royal procession entered the village, nearly everyone had abandoned whatever they were doing, eager to witness whatever had brought the prince himself to such a forgotten corner of the kingdom. Nobody could remember the last time a member of the royal family had stepped into the village without sending messengers ahead. Before long, the narrow path leading to Chioma's compound was filled with curious faces, each person trying to guess who the prince had come to see. No one imagined that the visit had anything to do with the quiet young woman who had spent her entire life walking through the village with her face hidden behind veils. Inside the compound, Omar was helping her mother arrange freshly gathered firewood when the sound of horses drew near. She stepped towards the entrance just as Chioma looked outside and froze. Her heart began pounding violently. For one terrifying moment, every painful memory she had spent years trying to bury came rushing back. She thought the palace had finally come to punish her daughter for disobeying the traditions she had spent her entire life trying to protect her from. Without thinking, Chioma grabbed Omara's wrist. "You must not go outside," she whispered anxiously. "Whatever happens, stay behind me." Before Omara could answer, Prince Jide stepped through the entrance of the compound. The entire village fell silent. His eyes searched the compound only briefly before resting on Omara. Even with her face covered once again, he knew it was her. Slowly, he walked towards her until only a few steps separated them. Then, from inside the fold of his royal robe, he brought out the veil she had left behind the previous night. "I believe this belongs to you," he said gently. Omara's eyes widened. She recognized it immediately. It was the very veil that had slipped from her shoulders as she fled the royal celebration. The villagers looked from the prince to Omara in complete confusion. Murmurs spread through the crowd. "How does the prince know her? Isn't she the mad woman's daughter?" Chioma lowered her head in shame. "My prince," she said with trembling hands folded respectfully before her, "if my daughter has offended the palace, I beg you, punish me instead. She knows nothing." Prince Jide looked at the frightened woman for a long moment before speaking. "No one has offended the palace." He turned towards Omar once again. The woman I came to find is standing before me." Another wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Several people laughed nervously, convinced the prince had been deceived. One elderly man stepped forward. "My prince, perhaps you do not know this girl. She has hidden her face since childhood. Her mother was once driven mad after her husband's death. People have always believed misfortune follows this family." Prince Jide listened quietly, then he smiled. "I know exactly who she is." He looked at Omar and spoke softly. "Will you trust me?" Omara's hands trembled. All her life, one instruction had echoed inside her mind: never let anyone see your face. She turned towards her mother. Tears were already streaming down Chioma's cheek. For the first time in many years, she saw not the frightened little girl who had struggled to protect, but the young woman standing before her. Slowly, she nodded. With trembling hands, Omar reached for the veil. The entire village held its breath. The clothes slipped gently from her face. A stunned silence followed. The women who had spent years gossiping her stared in disbelief. The men who had mocked the mysterious girl behind the veil forgot every word they had spoken. She was beautiful, not because she wore expensive beads or fine wrappers. She was simply breathtaking. Prince Jide smiled exactly as he had smiled the morning he saw her beside the river. "I knew I would find you again," he said quietly. Then, before the entire village, he turned to the king's advisor and spoke the words no one had expected. "This is the woman I have chosen." Chioma covered her mouth and broke down completely. For years, she had believed that the child growing inside her womb had been the beginning of every sorrow she endured. She had hidden Omara's face, not because she hated her, but because she feared the world would one day destroy her daughter, just as they had destroyed her. Yet, the same daughter she had spent a lifetime hiding had become the very person who restored honor to a family that had once been buried beneath shame. As the royal procession prepared to leave, Prince Jide walked beside Omara, while Chioma stood quietly at the entrance of the little compound, watching them disappear down the village path. This time, the tears on her face were not born from grief. They were tears of healing. Years later, people would tell the story of the mysterious girl behind the veil whose beauty captured a prince's heart. But those who knew the whole story always remembered something far more important. Omara had never been cursed. She had simply carried the weight of a pain that was never hers, and the veil that had hidden her face for so many years did not conceal her beauty. It concealed a mother's broken heart. If you've made it to the end of the video, please make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more interesting African stories.